So today, Pete Hegseth, President Donald Trump's nominee for Defense Secretary, he begins the official confirmation process with a hearing before the Senate Armed Services Committee. It's already underway. It's been underway all morning. It's been going nonstop. There's a lot of talk about Hegseth qualifications, his time as a media personality, mistakes he may have made in his personal life, his personal military record. But true to form, the liberal press has glommed onto something that fits their favorite narrative. Horror of horrors, Hegseth has announced his support for restoring the historic names of U.S. military bases. Say it ain't so! Glorification of Confederate generals, it's racism. No, it's really not. Take a breath, Nancy. You see, first of all, Hegseth can't just do it unilaterally. Any naming conventions being changed would likely require congressional approval because the naming commission was actually authorized by Congress to do certain things. But there is a strong sentiment that the 9 bases that were renamed during Biden's tenure as president, they were a massive overreach, an erasing of history, if you will, a woke washing of culture. You heard me, a woke washing of culture. But the breathless liberal media smells a chance to get their racism mantra back in the forefront, and they are salivating at the chance. Let me tell you, in 1986, while I was a young cadet working towards my commission as an Army officer, I had my first foray to a place that became like a second home in many ways. I can still remember driving through the gates of Fort Benning, Georgia for the first time in August of 1986 to attend the U.S. Army Airborne School, and 3 weeks later I departed again wearing the silver wings of a paratrooper. I was hooked on that place. In many ways, I still am. Over the next 3 decades, I came and went from Fort Benning. I stayed at first in the troop barracks and scrubbed the floors and latrines to a high shine to pass inspection. Later, I stayed in the quads as a young lieutenant where I had my own room and felt like a real person, up to the point that I finally had a senior officer's billet and attended receptions at the beautiful antebellum house called Rightside, where every post commander has lived for the last 100 years. At Fort Benning, Georgia, I have tramped the woods, run the streets, dropped on the drop zones, sat in the classrooms, dined in the mess halls, and marched on the parade grounds. I have walked among the monuments to past paratroopers and rangers and infantrymen and marveled at what they must have gone through. I was trained there at Fort Benning to become a paratrooper, a jump master, an infantry officer, a pathfinder. Eventually, I attended the battalion commander's pre-command course there a few years before I retired. While I was at Benning, I was sworn into the Order of St. Maurice, and later in life, I had the absolute unbelievable honor of going there again to pin paratrooper wings on my own son and watch him graduate from his own basic officer's course later. To say that Fort Benning, now Fort Moore, has been a part of my life is an understatement. And you know what? In all the years of sweat and toil and learning and leading at Fort Benning, Georgia, I never once felt like it was an oppressive place because it had the name Benning. I'm going to bet there's a bunch of you in this audience who've had Fort Benning in your life at some point, and like me, I'm going to bet that it never once crossed your mind that the name Benning came from a Confederate general. You know why? Because the Army is not racist, and no one who ever trained at Fort Benning was ever oppressed by its name. But the woke washing of America over the past few years foisted the belief on us that a part of what made the U.S. Army miss its recruiting goals and become less combat effective was that bases like Benning and Bragg and Rucker and Stewart and Hood had oppressive names. General Jack Keane, he said that in all the years that troops have trained at Benning that no one was ever impacted by the name because no one was there to focus on the name. No one ever even knew. But the Department of Defense Naming Commission spent millions of dollars to rename every street, post, base monument, building, parade field, and latrine that in many ways could be connected to the name of someone who served in the Confederacy over 150 years ago. The history of Fort Benning alone is significant. It was originally home to the major schools of the infantry. It branched into a maneuver warfare center in 2011 when they brought the armor school there too. You can't drive around Benning and not be awed by its history. From the mighty airborne towers, the statues and monuments, and the streets that are named for famous battles. Great leaders have been there like Dwight Eisenhower, George C. Marshall, David Grange, William Westmoreland, Colin Powell, H.R. McMaster, David Petraeus, Michael Flynn, and so many others. They've all served or trained there. And I would be quick to guess that none of them ever went through Benning feeling as though they had been oppressed because of the name. I doubt that any man of any color served at Benning and became less efficient as a leader of troops because of the name of the post. But the same woke washers that proclaimed climate change to be one of our key national security issues and forced the end of over 8,000 military careers for a COVID vaccine mandate, they determined it was necessary to spend $21 million to change the name. Names changed to signify to generations to come that we had a problem we didn't even know we had. You see, when cancel culture decides that we have a solution in need of a problem, they will turn to the specter of racism as one of their pieces of low-hanging fruit, whether it really exists or not. The question that we must ask ourselves, though, is where does it end? I mean, do we now need to go take books off of shelves that discuss the history of the Confederacy? Do we need the National Park Service to close down the battlefields at Chancellorsville and Manassas and Richmond and Kennesaw, since those are parks on sites where the Confederacy actually won battles? Is it time for the state of Alabama to rename Lee County, or to revisit the existence of the Port of Mobile since, the Battle of Mobile Bay took place there? Or even close down the state capitol building in Montgomery since Jefferson Davis once stood on its steps to be sworn in as president of the Confederacy? Should the state of Tennessee disavow the Battle of Lookout Mountain or Missionary Ridge? Look, the part of history that the naming convention has overlooked is that the naming of Southern bases and Army posts using names of Confederate officers, that was done not to honor them so much as it was to extend an olive branch to the populace in the wake of Reconstruction. There were still many survivors of the war between the states when those posts were first originated. The War Department determined to show the populace in those areas that it was a new day, that there was grace and forgiveness, a moving forward together. It was well received. And for over 100 years, there's been no question, and Benning was a hero factory, producing legends of all races, creeds, and colors who may have come into the Army looking one way when they got there, but they all left the same color of green, speaking the same language. My father, who was a career Army officer himself, he told me once how proud he was that the Army was the first true melting pot of society where any person could rise through the ranks. Some of the new names are tied to actual legends that I do respect, not the least of which is Fort Benning, which was renamed in honor of Lieutenant General Hal Moore, who was memorialized for his heroic leadership in the Ia Drang Valley in Vietnam. But some of the names, like Fort Bragg being rebranded as Fort Liberty, just seem lame. I mean, they could have at least named the fort as Fort Bragg as Fort Gavin, after the legendary paratrooper General James Gavin, who made 4 combat jumps with the 82nd Airborne in World War II. But, whatever. Here's an idea. How about Congress authorize the naming of the bases to be revested into the states that host them, with strong deference then being given to the local communities where the bases and posts are actually located, and then allow the local folks to have a true say in it all. Not some nameless woke-washing politician from D.C. who doesn't care about your local feelings. So if the people of Fayetteville, North Carolina want to keep the name Fort Liberty, fine. But if they want to bring back the name Fort Bragg, let it be their choice. Fort Moore? Maybe you bring it back to Fort Benning. And if they did, the world wouldn't end. Slavery would not suddenly be reinstituted. Young men and women of all races would still go there and become warriors, and not a one of them would care about the name. But maybe I'm just nostalgic, or maybe I'm old-fashioned or stuck in my ways, but it'll always be Fort Benning to me, and in my memories. The home of the airborne and the infantry, queen of battle. I look forward to the day that our U.S. military is taken off the list of social experimentation projects and returned to its rightful place as the greatest warfighting entity in the history of the world, no matter what the bases are named. And that's a wrap for the Rightside Way.